All right, today we're going to be doing Chapter 8. Now, Chapter 8 is still going over those early years, the years that Piaget would refer to as pre-operational. But we're going to be talking about emotional and social development, not cognitive, so it gets more into Erikson's theory instead of Piaget's theory, but it's still about the same area of time anyway. Um, now, they go over Erikson quite a bit in the book, um, but I had noticed that the book, the more I read the book, the more I notice that the book kind of biases itself a little bit in the, for lack of a better description, touchy-feely category. It wants to be nice and pleasant and it leaves out anything that anybody might consider negative. But unfortunately, we're talking about the human mind here, and there's a whole lot here that isn't necessarily nice and touchy-feely and goody-goody. And you see that a lot when she talks about Erikson's theory. Now, Erikson's theory is called initiative versus guilt, or initiative versus shame and doubt. And that's a valenced thing. You can do one or the other, and it is very true what they say in the book that um, this is the time when kids can start to do things on their own and learn to be initiative and be self-reliant and get a sense of power and pride about them. Which is obviously very important for motivating yourself in the future. But on the other hand, the book completely ignores the other side of that. What happens if your child does not do these things? What happens if your child does not seek to do things on their own? Um, and they doubt themselves. They get more shameful of themselves. They get a lot more guilt. Later on, they talk about guilt as being a possible motivator, but essentially, it's very much one or the two. But either one is very bad. If you need to have a little bit of shame and doubt. You need to question yourself to some degree. You can't be completely self-confident because then you're just going to be unrealistic and you'll never be able to accomplish anything because you won't know your limitations. Um, but then again, if you're completely quagmired in shame and doubt, then that's bad too. And that's kind of one of the points of the dialectic conflicts that Erikson has is each extreme is really, really bad. Um, Now, with the increased self-esteem, they go over self-esteem a lot in the book. And again, they really romanticize this. Um, and you'll probably have noticed at this point in your life that anything that's romanticized is not as good as it seems. We romanticize knights as being these great things, and yet really they were woman haters and you know looked very badly on anybody who wasn't rich. We romanticize pirates while they were murderers and rapists, and honestly, we romanticize self-esteem in this country, and it's not as great as it sounds. Yes, it is great to talk about. To think of yourself in a positive regard. It is certainly better than to think that you suck. But those aren't the only two options available to us. And it's certainly not the only two options available to our children. You are not obligated to teach every child that they can be whatever they want because they can't. And lying to your children isn't going to teach them to be better adults either. Um, I'm just to give me as an example, I'm 40 years old. I'm not in great shape. I'm fit, but I don't work out or anything. Um, I don't really like baseball. I could not become a baseball player professionally. No matter how much I wanted it, no matter how much I tried for it, I can't do it. I cannot become anything that I want to if I put my mind to it. Um, and this is simply a reality that we all have to live with, and lying to our children about this isn't doing them any favors. An artificial sense of self-importance, of self-esteem, is not actually beneficial to anybody, including children. Um, it might make them happy, but only in the short run, because it has negative effects. Because there are other self things as well. They talk about self-regulation. I will get into emotional regulation a little bit. in a second. And so self-regulation, controlling yourself, controlling when you are and are not going to feel certain things. They talk about self-conscious emotions, emotions that kind of give you a sense of who I am. If you have too high of a self-esteem, you're not going to be good at those self-conscious emotions. You're not going to be able to even figure out who you are. And the reason for that is because there's one more self word that they completely missed in the book, and that is self-awareness. Um, which is just as important as self-concept. And I think I glossed over self-awareness before. Self-awareness is the ability to see yourself in an objective light. And self-esteem is, in a large part, or at least in some cases and can be, the opposite of self-awareness. Because with self-esteem, you want to feel really good about yourself. But there comes a point when the self-esteem gets so high that the self-awareness has to decrease. In order to think of yourself, as good, you can be pretty self-aware. But in order to think of yourself as amazing, you've got to ignore some reality, and that self-awareness is going to go down. Quite so, to the point where people talk about narcissism. Narcissism, they think, is being in love with yourself, and colloquially, that is what it is. But actually, narcissistic personality disorder, somebody that has the personality disorder in a psychological sense, usually thinks they're an alien, or that they have some sort of special psychic power. Their self-esteem is basically so high that they think they're metahumans. They're like super beings. Because they have no self-awareness to speak of. So this is not healthy for anybody, including children. Now, I mentioned emotional regulation. They talk about it as self-regulation. But there are some... emotional regulation is one of those things that's really important throughout your entire development. So we'll cover this during the entire point. But it's really learned at this point. And essentially, the idea of emotional regulation is you feel emotions all the time. And some emotions you need to monitor. You know, if you're feeling very angry, do you want to continue to feel angry? Do you want to continue to think in an angry manner? No. Not only that, but in some cases, it's very detrimental. If you're in a social environment, if you're feeling very angry at somebody, it is not beneficial to anybody in any way to act angry. It just doesn't work. Other emotions that are quite pleasant, we'll actually get into that in a second. I'll mention the two different types that are very common of emotional regulation. The first one is called suppression. This is where you just kind of force back your emotions. This works relatively well, but it has some drawbacks. When you suppress emotions, you're not going to have the enjoyment that you would otherwise get out of them. And I'll give you an example of an emotion that you would want to suppress. And this is because the second strategy, by the way, that for your notes you can write underneath this, and then I'll continue talking about suppression, is cognitive reappraisal. And that means instead of just kind of forcing your emotions back down underneath you, kind of trying to ignore them, or at least make them so they don't show, cognitive reappraisal means that you think about the situation in a different way, so that you're trying literally not to even feel that way anymore. You're not just hiding it, you're trying to think about it differently, so not only do you not feel as much of the emotion, but you're less likely to feel that emotion in the future. So with these two situations, I'll give you a situation where you would use suppression. Horniness, for lack of a better term. So you're walking down the street, you see a really cute guy or girl, whatever you're into, walking down the street, and you're going to have a natural emotion of, I want to get with this person. They're very physically attractive. I would like to have sex with this person. Now, you don't want to use cognitive reappraisal because it's a pleasant emotion. It's nice to feel attracted to people. It's nice to want to have people. It gives you all sorts of positive feelings. So you don't want to think about it differently. You don't want to think to yourself, well, I'm never going to have this person, so I don't even want to really be attracted to them anymore. Some people do that, and they honestly wind up less happy for it. So instead, you use suppression. You kind of stick it down, and you're like, well, I'm not going to display this because it's socially inappropriate to display my lust of this individual. And that works fine. It's kind of a good time to use that strategy. Where with cognitive reappraisal, and some people do this, you may have met people, or maybe you do it yourself, where they say, well, I'm only attracted to my husband. By the way, it takes a lot of mental training to do that. Some people think that these people are just lying to themselves. Not necessarily. They can actually convince themselves that this is how they work through cognitive restructuring, cognitive reappraisal. You just continue to think of things differently over and over and over again until eventually you kind of brainwash yourself into thinking this way. And this, by the way, is typically the most effective strategy. This is the sort of thing to try to teach to children when you're dealing with emotional education, because they're being very, very frustrated. They're not getting their way. And she said, hey, calm down. You're being frustrated. When you're frustrated, you're going to need to think of these things differently. You don't want to just tell a kid to cram all their feelings inside, because honestly, there's a lot of drawbacks to emotional suppression. When you're suppressing a positive emotion, you don't get the benefit of a lot of the positive aspects of it. You still get a little bit of the positive aspects. You can still enjoy the lust of being attracted to somebody, but not as much as you otherwise would. But if it's a negative emotion you're suppressing, you still pretty much have all the drawbacks of it. And at the same time, you're still going to be very likely to feel the emotion again in the future. So if little Timmy is being very frustrated, you say, okay, well, first of all, you're going to want to calm down, but second of all, you're going to want to think about it a little differently. Yes, you can't play with the ball right now, but there are other things you can play with instead. You'll enjoy playing with the ball later. Instead, try to think of something else you could enjoy. And that will keep you less frustrated. And you're basically teaching little Timmy tools at this point. You're giving him tools so that he can solve the problem in the future. Through this cognitive reappraisal, which is part of emotional regulation. Now, one of the things that I mentioned a little bit yesterday with Chapter 7 was how to question kids. Now, one of the important parts is we have to realize that kids are in totally different stages of development. They are not tiny adults as much as John Watson thought they should be. They are not you, so you cannot assume that they are you. One thing that is very essential is how you talk to kids. It's different than how you talk to adults. And I know this sounds, well, of course, talking to kids is different than talking to adults, but in ways that we don't necessarily think. As a classic example, we teach children, inadvertently, we don't even realize we're teaching them, that if an adult asks a question more than once, it's because he gave the wrong answer the first time. And we kind of naturally do this. We say, okay, little Billy, what's 2 plus 2? Little Billy says 3. So you say, okay, Billy, what's 2 plus 2? We just ask him the question again. He naturally knows he got it wrong. That's why we asked him the question the second time. This has come up a lot in police investigations. Police, social workers, nurses, typically very bad at talking to children because they treat them like adults. Because you can ask an adult a question more than once of that sort of thing. You'd say, imagine doing this to an adult. Imagine saying, okay, Mr. Smith, did you murder Sam Jones? Mr. Smith's like, no. Mr. Smith, did you murder Sam Jones? Now he just looks stupid, right? You're not going to change your answer just because the question was asked more than once. But people do the exact same thing to a kid. They say, because keep in mind, kids, especially young kids of this particular developmental age, are convinced that adults have all the answers. We are gods to them as far as knowledge is concerned. So they say, okay, little Billy, did your teacher touch you in a bad place? Little Billy would say, no. Really? He didn't touch you in a bad place at all? And at this point, little Billy's like, he did? Because he's clearly told the wrong answer because you asked him the question more than once. In addition, children of this age, there are 5 personality traits called the Big Five personality traits. And I'd highly recommend Wikipediaing Big Five personality traits. It's fascinating how we work, and I'll probably mention it at several points throughout the semester. Um, One of the personality traits is agreeableness. And some people are simply more agreeable. You've probably met people who are contrary all the time, right? I mean, they always playing devil's advocate. You say one thing, they want to say another. It's just their nature to rebel. Children are not like that at all. They are highly agreeable. So when you ask them a question, you can't give them a a question that they can even answer yes or no to. I know that sounds like, well, you want to give them a simple question so that they can wrap their brains around it really easily. But on the other hand, kids want adults to like them. I mean, their whole life is easier if adults like them. And how do you get people to like you? You agree with them. So this is just a natural part of their lives. I was actually just yesterday talking to a social worker, and she mentioned that a question she had to ask parents when she did home investigations was, is there anything in your house that scares you? And this is a horrible question to ask a child. It's a great question to ask an adult, but these aren't adults. They're children. They're agreeable. You ask them a yes or no question, they're going to want to say yes. I actually saw a little girl asked this question. Actually, my daughter was asked this question a few years ago. Is there anything in the house that frightened you? And she said yes. And they said, well, what is it? And now she's like, oh, and you could see she was just racking her brain trying to figure it out. She's like, ferrets. It's just like she was all happy because she was able to rationalize her answer. It's like, we have ferrets and they can bite. No, at the time she was indeed afraid of the ferrets, so she didn't play with them. She wasn't really. There was no threat there. Which was obviously the point of the question is, does the child feel threatened in the home? But you can't ask it any yes or no question. The same question can be answered, but you have to ask it like you would ask a child, not an adult. You would say, how do you feel about living in your home? Tell me about living in your home. Nice open-ended non-yes or no questions. A child can wrap their brain around, you know, what's it like living in your home. You can't even say how do you like living in your home, because now you're adding the that they like it in there. You're artificially putting that in. But what is it like to live in your home? And they'll tell you. If there's a problem, they're going to tell you. So you always have to take the agreeableness into consideration, because it's such an integral part of their social structure. Now, this lecture is, I'll be honest with you, the emotional sections I'll go on a little bit longer. This will probably be a good half-hour lecture, as you probably noticed from the timestamp on the bottom. And that's because I do emotions. That's my specialty. And honestly, in this specific case, it's a little longer than normal because the book doesn't do that good of a job. It's a good book. I really like it in other aspects, but like I said, she tries to be a little bit too nice and touchy-feely, and in some cases flat out ignores reality. On page 203, for example, sorry, this is an example of something else. On page 206, she talks about punishment. Now, first of all, I'll talk about punishment a little bit more at the end here, and I'll show you guys a chart. But she talks about corporal punishment and all the drawbacks of corporal punishment. Corporal punishment is like spanking your child. Your child messes up, you cuff them on the back of the neck, that sort of thing. Any sort of physical punishment. And she describes it as physical punishment, and then later on describes it as corporal punishment. I'm not sure she really defines either one. And she talks about all the drawbacks of corporal punishment. And honestly, all these drawbacks are completely true if corporal punishment is done badly. Because there are rules on how to do any sort of punishment. And when she talks a couple of pages later about timeouts, she talks about how to do these better. She won't talk about how to do corporal punishment better, but she'll talk about how to do timeouts better. In fact, most punishment is highly effective for children if done correctly. So I'll now have to go over how to do it correctly. How to do punishment badly. Or how to do it correctly. And we're going to talk about physical punishment here. Reading through page 206, you'll notice that a lot of these things are based around the punishment being done a lot. Honestly, that's rule number one. don't do it very often. If you're using physical punishment on your child more than once or twice a week, it's not going to be very effective. It's going to have all the drawbacks they talk about on page 206. Physical punishment should be used for extreme cases. Your child, the example I think I gave in either a lecture or a discussion was, you have a 4-year-old child and she runs off in the middle of a parking lot. So, you take her aside, you give her a spanking. And that's another thing. It has to be immediate. That is rule number 2. Physical punishment must be immediate. This wait till your father gets home junk doesn't fly. It doesn't work. It's a classic, but it's a very ineffective classic. Rule number 3, very difficult to do. Keep your emotions out of it. Do not get angry when you're doing physical punishment. If you are going to spank a child, spanking a child is actually much better, as you'll notice throughout all these rules, than cuffing a kid on the back of the neck. Because the whole cuffing a kid on the back of the neck is, or swatting, or whatever term you use, I'm from Maine, we use a slightly different language there, is something that happens all the time. It's kind of a typical, you do it several times a day. And like I said, you don't want to do these that often. Because the advantage of physical punishment and why it works if used correctly better than other punishment is because it's seen as an extreme. So if you hardly ever use physical punishment and then the kid runs out in the middle of a parking lot and gets a spanking, the kid instantly knows, wow, this must have been really bad, because this doesn't happen a lot. I hardly ever get spankings. It suddenly becomes really important to the child. That's the other huge disadvantage of doing it all the time, is there are times when, for a child, when you need to let them know immediately and without doubt, you never can do this again. You're lucky you didn't get run over this time. So like I said, it has to be very immediate. It has to be very consistent. There has to be the next rule is that they have to, so every time the kid runs out of the parking lot, they get the same punishment. Consistency is very, very key here. They have to understand why. It can't just be the physical punishment. You have to actually tell them this is for running out in a parking lot. You can't be vague. You can't mince words. A lot of people, social workers, school teachers, nurses, they like to use these soft words that don't really describe what they're doing. It's like, well, you did a bad thing. No, don't talk to children like that. Don't say you were being mean. Tell them exactly what they did that was mean. They need to know specifically. So there's a lot of things that can make this very, very effective punishment. And then on page, the next page, I guess it's 207, she talks about timeouts. And she gets it totally wrong. Fortunately, she only wastes a couple of paragraphs on it. Timeouts are one of the most misused terms in psychology. What happened is they did a bunch of studies on timeouts. And they found out that timeouts were really, really effective. And then they put this out into the population, and it kind of got twisted. Now they started talking about timeouts in a different fashion. See, initially, timeouts were, you see, and anybody that's spent any time with kids, especially of this age, say between 4 and 7, you can see this coming as a parent. A bunch of kids are playing, they're going to get really riled up, and you know trouble is coming. Things are starting to escalate. This is when you do a timeout. Timeout is not a punishment. With the initial studies, it wasn't a punishment. It was a method of calming the kids down before anything bad happened. It was a preemptive maneuver. So you say, okay, you guys are getting, kind of wrestly. So why don't you? So here, have these coloring books. Why don't you guys start coloring instead? And the kids are all, okay, well, I'll color a dragon, I'll color a bear, whatever. That's what a timeout was. It was a preventative measure. It had nothing to do with you guys have already messed up. Now let's sit you in the corner. That's just a new way of talking about the school marm sitting a kid in the corner and putting a dunce cap on him. That is social punishment, how most people refer to timeouts as. You've messed up, now go sit in the corner and you think about what you've done. Um, that's shunning behavior. Like the whole tribe would turn their backs on you. And it can be effective in a social shame sort of way. But keep in mind, as you read this chapter, a lot of this, the cognitive development, is teaching children what shame is. They're going through the point of shame and doubt is that second part of Erikson's theory. They're going to, by the end of this, they can either develop initiative or develop shame and doubt. So you can't shame a kid who's 4 years old because they don't even understand the concept of shame yet. It is completely foreign to them. So sitting them in the corner doesn't mean anything to them. When you do sit them in the corner, though, when you do use that punishment-oriented timeout, it only works until about the age of 5. After that, it's almost completely ineffective because the kids learn to wait. I mean, how difficult is it to wait? And you set them aside for about 1 minute per year level. So a 2-year-old, you do 2 minutes, 3-year-old, 3 minutes, and it still only works for about 40% of the children. My daughter, for example, when she was 2, could wait for an hour. She was just a very stubborn kid, so a timeout would never have any effectiveness whatsoever for them. Now, like I said, the book gets into parental influences on page 203, the thing I was going to mention before. And this is another running theme that I want to talk about throughout the entire semester. And I know I worded it a little biased before, where I was mentioning that rich parents parent their children differently. Rich parents will push their children into careers, and poor parents will say, you can do whatever you want to do, and the rich parents wind up having happier children for it. But it's not really just about rich or poor. What it's about is a trend that, admittedly, the less wealthy parents do this more than the rich parents. But it's not about rich or poor. It's about the philosophy of free-range children, letting children be whoever they want to be, not pushing, not directing them. And this is another thing, because on page 203, it has a couple of paragraphs on what they call direct parental influences. And here they're talking about social development, and they're talking about parents that do things like have play dates for their children and say, okay, this is going to be your child, this is going to be your friend, now go play with your friend for 2 hours and then come back. Really directing the play of children. And the free-range parent fanatics hate this idea. They're like, no, I'm not going to do a play date. The child will be friends with whoever he wants to be friends with. And ultimately, it doesn't work as well. And if you direct your children's play, if you give them friends, contrary to popular belief, they get better at making friends on their own. They get less socially awkward. They'll have more friends that'll last longer. There's just altogether tons of advantages. So like I said, it's not really a rich or poor thing, but more a free range versus directed parenting style thing. And directed simply works better in most cases. There's some exceptions, of course, that I'm sure we'll get into. No, we were talking about discipline. One of the things that they get into with discipline is something they call inductive discipline. So they say, maybe you can sit down the child and say, well, okay, you hit little Billy on the head. Well, how do you think that made little Billy feel? You're trying to teach the kid empathy. Now, first of all, this is encouraged because through this age, they're trying to develop a sense of empathy. They're trying to get away from that self-centered thinking, if you remember that from a couple lectures ago, where they're only thinking about themselves. Their whole world is wrapped up in themselves, and they can't take the perspective of somebody else. But on the other hand, it's not punishment. It's not discipline. To even call it inductive discipline is a misnomer. I know that's what they named it, but it's not effective as discipline. It's effective as cognitive restructuring, as helping them reach the next stage. But as discipline, as punishment, it's completely ineffective because these are children who cannot empathize with somebody else. So to tell them, how does this make somebody else to feel, is a cognitive problem for them. It might be interesting for them to think about, but it's not punishment. It is recommended to go ahead and do this sort of thing, but not to pretend that you're actually punishing the child or even that you're going to change their behavior in any way whatsoever. You're just trying to punish them first, get that out of the way, try to alter their behavior, and then do this kind of thought process type of thing. Otherwise, you're just pretending that the child is in a cognitive state that they're simply not in yet, and they can't really understand these things yet. Another thing that we go over that is kind of pretending that children are in a state that they're not in is Bandura's social learning theory. Now, they get into this in the book. They get into this with all books. This is the Bobo doll experiment, Bandura's famous Bobo doll experiment. Um, and what they found with social learning theory is, by all means, it is true. Children model parents. But it's not like they can play they model everything that they see. But it's not like they'll play a violent video game and then go out shooting people. And we're talking about this in discussion this week, so I don't want to give away too many answers on why children don't really go around shooting people after playing violent video games. But part of it is that social learning theory needs to be situationally appropriate. And maybe you can go ahead and use this in the discussion, because I'll admit it is a key. But it has to be situationally appropriate. So you're going to copy things that are in the same situation. So I see this all the time because I have two children. They're in second grade and third grade. And they're bringing home these things saying, help your child to read, encourage your child to read to your children. But really the way, I think to all the people that I know that read all the time, and their parents read all the time. See, they modeled their parents. I can tell my children to read all day till I'm blue in the face. Why do they read? Because I read. I read textbooks, I read articles, I even read novels. If you ever notice, most people that smoke have parents that smoke. There's some social modeling for you right there, because it's completely situationally appropriate, right? Let's face it. Let's look at a typical situation a kid will see. They'll see dad come home from work. He's all stressed out. What's he gonna do to relax? What's he gonna do to unwind? Is he gonna sit down in front of the boob tube and watch a couple hours worth of drama? Maybe watch an action movie? Is he going to have a beer and a cigarette? Is he going to read a novel? Is he going to come home and hug his wife and have a good conversation with her and relax through social support? The little kid is going to see this, and yes, he's going to model it. Because he's going to be in the exact same situation. He's going to have a hard day of school. So what's he going to want to do? Is he going to want to use a vice like a cigarette or beer? Is he going to want to use social support? Is he going to want to plop down in front of the boob tube to unwind? Is he going to want to pick up a book? Whatever they see you do when they're in the same situation, they're going to want to do that themselves. That's when social learning theory really kicks in. So it's less with video games and a lot more with watching how the parents react to certain situations. Kids are great at this. The last thing that I want to go over is the punishment matrix. And I know we're running a bit long here, but positive punishment, negative reinforcement, and positive reinforcement are really kind of key issues. And so what I want you to do is I want you to look up the punishment matrix. And I'll break it down for you here. It's basically it's a 2x2 table, so it's got 4 squares. And it's divided up into reinforcement or punishment and positive and negative. So like on the top you might have positive and negative. On the side you might have punishment or reinforcement. Anything where we use the word punishment is talking about trying to decrease the likelihood of that behavior happening again. And this is really important, so I will repeat it for those of you who are taking notes. Punishment means you are trying to decrease the likelihood of behavior happening again. Reinforcement is trying to increase the likelihood of the behavior happening again. I guess one advantage of the video is you can just pause it instead of having me repeat the same thing over again. Um, and so people use these incorrectly sometimes. Um, because the next part is the positive and negative. Positive means you are giving something. Negative means you are taking something away. So some people think of like, well, it's negative punishment. You're spanking the kid. No, 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 that's not negative punishment. It is punishment. You're trying to decrease the behavior to happen in the future. You know, the kid stole a cookie, so you spank him. Trying to decrease that behavior from happening again in the future. But it's not negative. We might think of it as negative because it makes us feel bad, but that's not what negative and positive is all about. Negative and positive is about giving something or taking it away. You are giving them pain, so that is called positive punishment. An example of negative punishment, if you wanted to fill in that particular box, if you're drawing this out in your notes, which I hope you are, negative punishment is, again, you're trying to decrease the behavior from happening again because it's punishment, but you're doing it by taking something away. So you'd be taking away something good. So you'd say, okay, well, you stole a cookie from the cookie jar, so you don't get dessert tonight. You're not going to get this good thing. Negative punishment, not really that effective for any of the children of the age that we're talking about right now, because they don't, if you remember right, until they really get to the concrete operational stage cognitively, they don't understand time that well. So you can say you won't be able to do this later on, and it kind of means nothing to them. So then you get into, so that's punishment. You have positive punishment and negative punishment. Say spanking versus you don't get dessert tonight. So then you have reinforcement. Positive reinforcement. You're giving them something positive to try to increase their behavior in the future. Reinforcement. So this is a reward. You did really good in school today. Here, have a cookie. Relatively effective. And then the last one, of course, is negative reinforcement. Which again, some people, if you think of negative and positive as being good or bad, negative reinforcement doesn't even make any sense. But so negative reinforcement is you're taking away something so that they will do something again in the future. So obviously you got to take away something bad. So you did, you got an A in school, you don't have to wash the dishes tonight. You're taking away something they don't want as a reward. And this is often described as relief. You're giving them relief as a reinforcement. So I like to go over that. I'm sure it'll probably be on the test, so that we can make sure and use the proper terminology and not call spanking negative punishment, because it frankly just isn't. So we'll be going over the next half of Chapter 8 next time.